I'm Robert Hunt, the Director of Global Theological Education at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. And I'm quite happy to contribute this devotion to my friend and partner, Andrew Harper with Cliff College. Very glad to be working together with you, Andrew. Let's get started. Just this week, I heard a public radio show called Hidden Brain, and it was about moral convictions. Psychologically, these are seen by us who hold them as facts, objective facts in the world. Even though if we could step back, we would see that actually what we call moral convictions are really a very subjective state of mind. But it isn't merely that we see moral convictions as objective facts. We associate our own moral character with upholding our moral convictions. Thus, if someone disputes our moral convictions, they are equally calling into question our moral character. And if they cannot be convinced that we are right and they are wrong, then at very least we have a deep psychological need to remove them from our presence, them and their questioning of our moral character. That's the only way we can maintain our psychological balance. Or alternatively, we can remove ourselves from their presence. Either way, the emotion that is associated with this need to move apart from somebody else is hatred. The person who disputes our moral convictions is a person who, to some degree, we have a psychological need to hate. Now, of course, as Christians, we can see that the psychology of moral convictions, demonstrated through scientific tests and reasoning, comes into direct conflict with the command of Christ that we love our neighbors as ourselves. But to fully understand how we can learn to love and include those who do not share our moral convictions, we need to talk about the Bible and some rather unfortunate history that comes after the Bible. Part of the long story of the Bible, our Christian Old Testament, is the story of how the Hebrew people became more and more aware of the breadth and diversity of God's love. By the time we get to the 8th century prophets, we have learned with Israel that God's love and concern for humans is truly universal. In Amos chapter 9, God reminds Israel that divine guidance not only led Israel out of Egypt, but it led the Philistines out of Kaftor and the Aramaeans out of Kir. Whether in blessing or judgment, Israel has no special place. In the Psalms, in Isaiah, in Malachi, we find the same affirmation, not only that God cares for all humanity, but that all humanity in some way worships and honors God. This idea, hinted at poetically in Psalm 87, which asserts that all the peoples of the earth have their birthplace in Zion, this idea comes to its fulfillment in the universality of inclusion found in the teaching and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He not only finds faith among the nations of the earth, the universal impact of his death and resurrection breaks down the last barrier between the righteous and the unrighteous. All are saved when he is lifted up above the earth and he draws all people to himself. Unfortunately, at a very early stage in its history, our Christian community turned away from the trajectory that began when Abraham was called to be a blessing to the families of the earth and was marked through to when the apostles were sent to the ends of the earth. By its 2nd or 3rd century, the church, instead of focusing on the breadth of God's love, began obsessing about who was saved and why. Rightfully eschewing the divisions Paul so clearly decried, the church instead focused on new divisions between the baptized and the unbaptized, between those who held orthodox beliefs and those who didn't. In Christ, there might not be Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, but for the emerging Catholic Church, there was clearly a difference between the saved and the damned, or between the Orthodox, the heretics, the apostates, and the pagans. The old categories that might have divided the nascent Christian church in the time of Paul were replaced by new categories suited to an empire, suited to a civilization. Everything was based on whether you were baptized or not, whether you held the right beliefs or not. The practice of damning the pagans and anathematizing fellow Christians became a Christian habit. These divisions were complemented, if we may use the word, by the hierarchical view of the created order that could be drawn from the Genesis account of creation and Neoplatonism, to get the heavenly part. Paul's poetic vision aside, his own hierarchical understanding of the orderliness of God's creation would eventually justify the perpetuation of human social hierarchies that were as exclusive as any in the pagan world. You've surely seen these medieval illustrations of how the whole world is bound around God's feet with golden chains. But where does that world begin? It begins in hell with the fallen. It moves up through the different levels of the natural world, the different levels of the earthly world, the ecclesial world, the angels and the archangels, Christ and God at the top. A fixed hierarchy in which everybody was given their place and in which place everybody was supposed to stay. Now, these were not finally overcome by Enlightenment universalism and egalitarianism, which the church, by the way, fought tooth and nail anyway. Instead, Enlightenment Christians like Schleiermacher would devise their own new hierarchies, all appearing very scientific. And in the United States, emerging scientific theories of race were readily read back into biblical accounts of ethnic distinctions in order to justify enslaving Africans. The mark of Cain, the descendants of Ham, were blessed with forced conversion and then cursed with slavery. The result of all this is that contemporary Christian churches have inherited far too few traditional resources for comprehending the diversity of the world in its emerging forms. And our church is thus ill-equipped to realize in its life and in the larger life of society the inclusiveness that is the natural result of the universality of God's love revealed in Jesus Christ. Instead, and indeed despite a century of ecumenism, differences in belief quickly devolve into differences between the saved and the damned. And a diversity of cultures and customs, of lifestyles, of sexuality, these are all too quickly mapped out onto the distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. And every effort to say that we need to break down those hierarchies is seen as an attack on the moral order that underlies our moral convictions. And this brings us directly into what I spoke about earlier in terms of moral convictions. The traditional church has imbued us with a set of moral convictions, and indeed a moral order, that only very grudgingly makes way for genuine diversity and inclusion. But we do have a resource, and that resource is Jesus Christ and his teaching. It takes little effort when one reads the conflicts between Jesus and the teachers of the law to see a new revelation that actually interrogates moral convictions. That is what Jesus does with great consistency. He questions the moral convictions by which the Jews of his day lived and loved and hated. Even the disciples of Jesus were sometimes aghast at the way he broke down their conventional moral codes, whether conversing with the Samaritan woman at the well or mixing with the unclean and the uncouth. If you had a moral conviction, he poked it. In our time, Jesus is the one who leads us into the questioning of our own moral convictions. It is precisely the old law written on our hearts and leading us into hateful hearts that we need to question. It is the old law that must be replaced by a new law, the law of love. Instead of letting our neighbor's disagreement with our moral convictions lead us into just another form of ritual cleanliness and isolation, another variation on the old hatred for apparent unrighteousness, we need to see in our neighbor the probing of Jesus himself. The neighbor who will not let us rest easy in our convictions is like the prisoner, the sick, the hungry, the naked, an incarnation of Christ, demanding that we love our neighbor as ourselves. Not merely when, but particularly because he or she is poking at our posture of moral confidence and asking us to find ourselves not in our own righteousness, but in the righteousness of Christ. In a time of deep divisions, exclusion, and hatred, the teaching of Christ provides a guide for those who have been blind guides. When the Pharisee heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And on these two we must hang together or we will fall apart. Thanks very much.